morning. We're working. Okay. Am I on? I can hear myself. Yeah, good. Okay. So last week, Dan started us off at the beginning of Mark 6, and today I'm carrying on the second half. So we're going to be reading from Mark 6, verse 30. And I'm hoping it will be a story that you all recognise. I'll just give you a minute in case you want to follow. So Mark 6, verse 30. So the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Then, because so many were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then Jesus told them to make all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks, and he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. So this is a pretty significant miracle. I'm sure you'd agree. So the feeding of the 5,000, interestingly, is the only miracle, aside from the resurrection, that's recorded in all 4 gospel accounts. It's famous. I'd imagine anyone that you stop on the street would have heard of it. It's also pretty unique among miracles. So while we can appreciate and celebrate someone being healed from leprosy or a paralyzed man walking again, we'd all agree that actually we can all relate to this. We've all been hungry. At the start of Mark 6, that was looked at last week, the apostles have been sent out by Jesus. They've gone off in their pairs on their ministry trips, all exciting. After 2 years of following and witnessing his miracles, Jesus had given them authority, and he'd sent them off so that they could go and multiply his ministry. And the news of Jesus was spreading. So where we're starting from today, in verse 30, the disciples gather back in. They come back from their trips, and they're going to report all they've done and all they've taught to Jesus. They were excited. They were really excited to tell Jesus all they got up to. They were exhilarated, but they were exhausted. They thought that it completed an epic mission. But Jesus was about to teach them that it was just the beginning. The crowds, unfortunately, don't quite get it. They're not giving them any space to debrief. They don't realize that this group is off duty now. So Jesus says in verse 31, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place to get some rest." So off they go. They head off in a boat together across the lake. In that moment of pressing urgency of the crowds, Jesus suggests that they retreat for a rest. So the disciples go with him. They debrief, probably grieve with Jesus over the death of his cousin, John the Baptist, and they have some downtime. Jesus teaches by example in this moment that rest is important, that it's okay to stop and to remove yourself from the busyness, from the people. So they head to a solitary place in a boat. They're on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee, and they travel by boat across the lake, probably about a 2-hour trip. However, their quiet destination doesn't turn out to be so quiet. The crowds are desperate to see Jesus. They followed them around the lake, running on foot, and by the time they arrive, huge crowds have gathered. Can they not take a hint? The disciples were hungry and tired, but Jesus had a different attitude. In verse 34, it says, He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Sheep without a shepherd, what does this mean? Well, sheep with a shepherd, obviously, are safe. They're settled and they're grazing. Sheep without a shepherd, however, are wild. They're not cared for and they're lost. This term is actually seen a lot in the Old Testament. God's people are described over and over as sheep without a shepherd. And God's promise is to provide a shepherd to rescue them. In Ezekiel 34, verse 10, it says, "I will rescue my flock. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them, as a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he's with them, so I will look after my sheep." This crowd doesn't know that they're lost sheep, but Jesus sees, and he is stirred with compassion. I love this notion of him being stirred with compassion. Jesus is compassionate. He cares so deeply. It's in his nature. It's who he is. In Matthew 11, verse 29, Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." This is actually the only place in the Gospels where Jesus talks about his own heart. He says that he's gentle and humble, and he invites us to come to him. Not just when it's convenient or when you've got everything sorted, but when you're weary and burdened. So what he claims about his heart here, we see in his actions time and time again throughout the Gospels. What he is, he does, and he can't act any other way. He is moved by compassion. There are so many examples in the New Testament. In Mark, he tells us about a man with leprosy who came and knelt in front of Jesus, begging for healing. The man said, "If you're willing, you can heal me and make me clean." Moved with compassion, it says, Jesus reached out and touched him. "I am willing." In Matthew 20, Jesus says to two blind men, "What do you want me to do for you?" They say, "Lord, let our eyes be opened." Again, moved by compassion, Jesus touched their eyes and they were immediately healed. There are many times when Jesus is moved by compassion for crowds of people who are lost. Matthew 9, it says Jesus traveled through all the towns and villages, teaching in the synagogues and announcing the good news about the kingdom. And he healed every kind of disease and illness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, again, like sheep without a shepherd. So in our passage today, Jesus was moved by compassion, firstly, for their need for teaching. They were lost and they needed guidance. The other gospel accounts of this story do refer to the fact that he also healed them. But this account talks about his priority was to heal their souls, to teach them. However, he wasn't only concerned about their spiritual needs, he was moved to action for their physical need for food as well. Compassion is defined as that feeling that arises when you're confronted with someone's suffering and feel motivated to relieve the suffering. It's not the same as empathy. Empathy is when we feel the pain and suffering of others. But compassion is feeling it and then seeing a need and doing something to help. The Greek word for compassion used in this text refers to the internal organs, the guts. I'm not going to try and say it. It's the feeling in your gut when you're moved so deeply by something that you feel it in the pit of your stomach. It's more than pity. It moves us so strongly that we can feel it physically and we're compelled to respond. This compassion reflects the deepest heart of Christ. He is overwhelmed by the need and the desire to help when he sees our need. Jesus is filled with compassion the same for you today, as he was for that crowd. He's searching for you as a shepherd looks for his sheep. He's filled with a desire to love you and to care for you. We sometimes expect Jesus' response to us in our sin and our suffering to be like us, reaching to touch a slug or a spider, kind of face screwed up, cautiously extending your arm, holding back that kind of yelp of disgust. We can picture him approaching us with caution or disgust. However, we look at the Bible, we see this isn't the case. His heart is gentle and humble, full of compassion. It's who he is. Jesus' compassion always leads to action, whether it be teaching or healing, feeding or providing. I wonder what it would look like if we were moved with compassion in the same way. Moving on. It was a remote place and it was late. So the disciples go to Jesus. Verse 35, they say, "Send the people away so they can go and buy themselves something to eat." They were really fed up. They can't contain their frustration any longer. It's late and they are hungry and tired. These were the same disciples who'd been off on their amazing trips, seeing miraculous things happen, but right now they have no concept of this being another opportunity for the miraculous. Jesus has a different idea. What we see as a problem, Jesus sees it as an opportunity. He says in verse 37, "You give them something to eat." The disciples were not expecting that. They're astounded at his request. They're thinking of the cost, the logistics, they're thinking in human terms. There are 5,000 men, plus women and children, so probably more like 10 or 15,000 people. They're focused on the overwhelming size of the need. They're not focused on the resources that God has placed at their disposal. So Jesus says to them in verse 38, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." Well, in John's account of this story, it tells us that Andrew goes off and he finds a young boy willing to give up his packed lunch. And so they return. They've got 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. I'm thinking sardines, like little fish, not big ones. So verse 39, Jesus tells the disciples, he says, "Organize the people, sit them down in groups of hundreds and 50s. And here, Mark actually gives us a lot of detail. He says that he sat them down on the green grass. This means that we're actually able to date this to the spring. There wasn't a lot of green grass in Israel, apart from in the spring. And this was the time that the Jews would have been celebrating Passover, which would probably explain why there were such loud crowds and so many people around. Thousands of people would travel to celebrate the Passover every year. So they were heading to Jerusalem to sacrifice their Passover lamb. But here, they're actually seeing the Passover lamb in action, and they didn't know it. The Passover festival is a celebration in the Jewish calendar, like Christmas. Back in their history, they were slaves in Egypt. God intervened to rescue them, so they celebrated every year. In Egypt, the lamb's blood was painted on the door to the Jewish homes. This act of faith caused the destruction to pass over the household, and the blood on the door showed that they were trusting God to save them. Those inside were left unscathed. The blood of Jesus in our lives causes God's judgment to pass over our sin. We place our trust in that blood, and it gives us life as believers, children of God. The Old Testament Passover lamb, although a reality at this time, was a mere foreshadow of the better and the final Passover lamb, Jesus. Through his sinless life and sacrificial death, he became the only one capable of giving people a way to escape death and a sure hope of eternal life. Verse 41, Jesus has the bread, he looks up to heaven, he gives thanks, and he broke the loaves. And then again, he invites the disciples, come and take part in this miracle. He gives it to them. He says, "Off you go, hand it out." I mean, we know that Jesus could have just done it himself. You know, he's going about some pretty amazing miracles here, but actually, he chooses to invite them in to take part in this. He intentionally draws them in. He's teaching them that this is part of their new lifestyle, part of their new kingdom ministry. They become waiters at one of the most famous meals in history. What a privilege. What's God inviting you to be involved in right now? Where are you seeing his miraculous or his kingdom at work? Can you imagine that moment when they realize that the food isn't running out? The reaction of the disciples, the people in the crowd, the little boy maybe who offered it in the first place. The crowd were experiencing a massive miracle of creation and multiplication right in front of them. Can you imagine the disciples must have turned pretty quick from being tired and grumpy to being pretty energized? So verse 42, it says, "They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of leftovers." So essentially, every disciple goes off with their basket, and they all return with a basket of leftovers. Imagine that lesson that they learned at this minute. That his provision is abundant and is more than enough. They discover that living their lives serving Jesus and serving others is far more exciting and fruitful than living for themselves. Jesus is teaching them that ministry is more than those short-term mission trips that they've just come back from. It's a lifestyle of meeting the need in front of you, giving yourself away and trusting him for provision and multiplication. This miracle would have reminded the disciples and the people in the crowd of another time when a multitude of people were fed miraculously in a desolate place by God. When the Israelites were in the wilderness, following their rescue from slavery in Egypt, God literally was their daily bread. The manna sent from heaven was their daily provision. God had delivered his people from slavery, fed them in the desert, and then in Deuteronomy 18, Moses prophesies that God would raise up another prophet and says you must listen to him. In this passage, Jesus is living out this truth right in front of them, and he's showing them who he is. In John's account, he tells us that after seeing this miracle, some of the crowd began saying, surely this is the prophet who's come into the world. There's both encouragement and challenge in this passage. That Jesus cares for both our spiritual and our physical needs. We're both spiritual and physical beings. God made both parts of us. He loves both parts of us. And it's important to trust him for both, and okay for us to pray about both. He's provided for our physical needs in ways that we take for granted all the time. The natural world that he's created provides us with a constant source of food, every flavour and texture that we could imagine. And the natural occurring remedies and medicines are extensive. Often the way he provides for our physical needs is through others as well. Those people that are sensitive to his spirit, who are obedient to the nudges of Jesus, to provide food or shelter or money or transport, lifts to church. Those people are participating in God's provision plan for you. We also know of many stories in people's lives where something or someone has arrived just at the right time, or the exact amount of money needed has arrived out of the blue. Jesus cares about our practical and physical needs. Are we thankful for his provision? Well, Jesus models thankfulness here. He looks up to heaven and he gives thanks. Do we trust him for our daily bread? It's in the Lord's Prayer. We say it without thinking sometimes. It says, give us today our daily bread. Maybe God's asking you to be involved in his plan to provide for someone else. Are you listening and being obedient to his call? There's also an encouragement here to bring what we can, because Jesus can use it. So the boy, described in John's account, gave his packed lunch. He was willing to give up what little he had, and he saw Jesus do amazing things with it. Jesus has blessed us all with things that he can use. It may be skills, talents, money, or time. Whatever we have, if we're willing to use it for his kingdom, Jesus can use it for his glory. We're called to be good stewards of what we're given, reminding ourselves that what we have isn't ours, but God's, which he's given to us to use. It makes it easier to give it away. This passage is also a reminder to us of his supernatural multiplication. We may feel that what we have is small and insignificant. What we can do really isn't much. But actually here we see that Jesus is about turning little into big. He's the master of multiplication. Here he literally multiplies and creates bread and fish. But there are many things and many times when we can offer the small, seemingly insignificant things we have, and God can multiply it. The disciples have seen Jesus turn water into wine, but it doesn't occur to them to trust him for provision of bread. We can limit our possibilities by looking at just what we have in front of us, and we can neglect to ask Jesus what he wants to do with it. We need faith to believe that God can do more than we can imagine with the things that we have to offer. Following this story in Mark 6, he goes on to tell the story of Jesus walking on the water. After the mass feeding, Jesus sends the disciples off again in a boat, and he goes off to a solitary place up on a mountainside to pray. Jesus sees the disciples struggling against the wind. So in verse 48, it says, shortly before dawn, He went out to them walking on the lake. They are afraid and they think that he is a ghost, but he says, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." He climbs into the boat and the wind dies down. Verse 51, it says, the disciples were amazed. They'd just seen two incredible miracles. Feeding of the 5,000, Jesus walking on the water. They're amazed. But then it goes on to say in the next verse, in verse 52, but they'd not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Interesting verse. The miracles were amazing, but somehow it didn't cause them to worship. Somehow their hearts had strayed into a place of hardness, a lack of understanding, maybe a lack of joy where there should have been so much joy. What hadn't they understood? It wasn't just about the little boy being generous and giving what he had, or Jesus doing big things with the little. When we read parables or events in the gospel, we can sometimes jump to a moralistic message, like a fable. Jesus feeds the 5,000 with bread and fish. You too can do great things from small beginnings. But the big picture here is actually who Jesus is. The miracle only happens because of him, the promised shepherd, the same one that delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, who sent the plagues, who parted the waters, the one true Passover lamb. It's easy for us, like the disciples, to be amazed by the miraculous. But it's important that we see the bigger picture and what it tells us about who Jesus is. That he's full of compassion and that he would eventually give himself, the bread of life, for those who would accept him. The disciples would get it eventually when they see the resurrected Jesus. His body became the bread broken for them. His blood poured out for them, their Passover lamb. In John's Gospel, following the account of this miracle, Jesus goes on to explain it further. He says in verse 48, "I am the bread of life.